Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our September 2025 tour, The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, is open for bookings and selling out fast. This incredible week-long experience takes in many of the most iconic historical sites associated with Anne Boleyn, including Hampton Court Palace, the Tower of London, and of course Anne Boleyn Mecca, Hever Castle, where we will actually be having a 2-night stay featuring a Tudor banquet in Hever's Great Hall. Guest speakers include Sandra Fasoli, who will be telling us all about Anne Boleyn's letter from the Tower, Natalie Grueniger, who will discuss Anne's final hours and execution, and in her very first appearance on a tour, Sophie Bacchus-Waterman, the author of the very first biography of Elizabeth Boleyn, which is due for release later this year. Sophie will be joining us to discuss how Elizabeth and Thomas Boleyn coped in the fallout of May 1536. With 5-star accommodation throughout and unparalleled access to some of England's most striking Tudor venues, this is a tour not to be missed by lovers of Anne Boleyn's story. To discover more on this and secure your place on this or our other tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Brigitte Barnard is a Tudor fictional author and fully qualified midwife who joins me today for a fascinating discussion all about Tudor midwifery. We cover the stories of Tudor women from the very top of society, such as queens and the nobility, right down to the poorest of Tudor England, from the rules around confinement to bizarre birthing rituals that the Tudors believed in, to the things that remain as prominent in giving birth today as they did for those in the 16th century. We also explore some of the stories told about the ramifications of Henry VIII's wives' pregnancies, from what ultimately killed Jane Seymour to a theory around Henry VIII's blood type being the root cause for much of his wives' misfortunes. This is a fantastic discussion, so buckle in and prepare to learn all about what went down in the birthing chambers of Tudor England. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 72, Tudor Midwifery with Brigitte Barnard. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Brigitte Barnard. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Adam?
Very well, thank you. Very well. I'm going to the Catherine of Aragon festival this weekend. Turns out that's a thing.
Oh, I am so jealous. I wish I could go to.
Yeah, it's going to be a good few days. It's in Peterborough, somewhere I've never been, and it's where
beautiful.
It's where Catherine's buried. So it's that's where the festival takes place.
Yeah, I've heard it's a memorable site.
Yeah, by all accounts, it's beautiful. So we're here today. I'm so interested to hear all about this subject. We're here to talk about Tudor midwifery. Before we get into that conversation, though, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full-time?
Yes, of course. So what do I do now? I write full-time, and I raise Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, and I do a lot of research. I'm currently in the middle of writing the third book that's in this midwifery series. So the first book is out, the second book is finished, but won't be published for, half a year to a year. And I'm right in the middle of the third book, which is a lot of research and a lot of double checking dates and things like that. So that takes up a lot of time for me.
Nice. And whereabouts are you based?
So we travel around a lot, and I grew up in Colorado, and that's mainly where we are, Colorado, and, traveling around a bit. We do a lot of traveling back and forth to Europe and things like that.
Lovely. I'm not sure whether this is a bit of an urban legend with regard to Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, but There's a thing that I think is actually true, is that in the UK, because they were so popular with Charles II, I want to say, they're technically viewed as a royal breed of dog. And so
100%.
even in places where it says no dogs, if it's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, technically you can circumnavigate that rule, I believe.
That's true. Cavaliers are the only dog that are allowed in the Parliament.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So what sparked your passion for Tudor history, and I suppose by extension of that, Tudor midwifery?
Okay, so as a child, I was a voracious reader, and I think the Jean Plady books probably sparked my interest the most, and I read everything I could find. And went from one end of the library to the other until I'd read everything I could find on Tudor history. And so I think it started really young, and it's always been a passion of mine.
Nice. So if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you could jump in a sort of time travel machine, what would it be?
Oh, definitely Anne Boleyn's coronation.
Same.
Yeah, it has to be.
Yeah. What I'd love about that is to just look around and see who I recognise based on portraits.
Yeah, that would be so interesting.
Yeah. You know, like, oh, there's Charles Brandon. Oh, there's,
right.
You know, that would be quite fun.
And we might all be shocked at what Anne looked like. Who knows?
Well, who knows? I mean, that's a whole can of worms, isn't it?
Isn't it?
I like to believe that the Holbein sketch that's not the double chin one, the one where...
Right, I know about that, yeah. Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, I think that one could possibly be her, but we'll see. So is there a Tudor misconception that you would love to change?
Yes. Anne Boleyn was born in 1507, not 1501.
That's what you think?
That's what I think.
Agreed. 100%. She's 1507 all the way.
Absolutely.
What makes you think 1507?
Because Henry, he was in love with her, true. I'm sure he was very infatuated, but he was a practical man, and he was looking for a breeder. Why would he choose a woman who was well into or possibly past her best breeding years?
Yeah, totally agree. For me, it is that straightforward. And sort of by extension of that, Anne's age is never, ever mentioned, even by her fiercest enemies.
Never, exactly.
And if she were in her early 30s by the time Henry marries her, that would have been brought up, and it would have been brought up by her enemies in particular. And it's
absolutely
never mentioned.
Yeah, Chapuis would have been all over that.
Yeah, exactly. I that for me is irrefutable. Well, it's not irrefutable, but it would have been mentioned. And the whole 1501 thing, it rests basically on what it rests on is that letter.
Exactly.
But letters, maybe she just had really good penmanship. Maybe it was scribed. It's too difficult to say.
I have a son who had incredible penmanship at the age of 6. Unbelievable penmanship. He could write so beautifully. I mean, it happens. Kids can have great penmanship, and the letter could have been dictated to her.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as I said, we're here today to talk about Tudor midwifery, something I know very little about, so I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say. And I'd like to sort of structure this by, I suppose, looking at the different classes of Tudor women. And we'll start at the top. We'll start with the women for whom the production of healthy children was the most crucial, queens, in particular Queen's Consort. So... When a queen consort believed that she might be pregnant, at that stage, were midwives involved? Were they brought in to try and ascertain a pregnancy, or was that done by doctors? Was that done by other people?
No, it was definitely done by midwives. And I have to backtrack a little bit and say that it would depend on the woman. Because a woman with her first pregnancy, if she doesn't have regular menstrual cycles, might not realize right away that she was pregnant. So it could be later on that she realizes that she has signs that are typical of pregnancy, such as increased breast size and morning sickness. Then that would be a time to call the midwife and confirm the pregnancy. So, and if it's a more experienced woman who's had already children, then she might wait longer to call the midwife because she already knows what to expect. Generally, the midwife would have been called under regular circumstances at about 12 weeks in pregnancy, then again at around 20 weeks, and then at the end of the pregnancy, then she would have entered the confinement room with her queen or member of the peerage.
Okay, so, I mean, and I suppose because we're talking about an age when women had many, many children, if they could, I suppose, to your point, when once you've had 2 or 3, you know the signs that you're looking out for.
Absolutely.
But aside from the menstrual cycle, which is obviously one of the big giveaways, what were the other signs the Tudors were looking for?
Well, the Tudors, they had this obsession with cravings. So they always thought that that was a sign. Oh, she's craving apples. She must be pregnant. Or she's craving quail. She must be pregnant. So I think they looked a lot at things like unusual cravings, increase in appetite, onset of morning sickness, and again, increase in breast size.
Yeah. So it was the things that we would still look for now, really, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's the biological process is still the same.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say a pregnant person 500 years ago was no different to today. It's just that
absolutely
the medical side of things is obviously far improved. So once a queen became pregnant, how far into the pregnancy would they continue to appear before the court to carry out official engagements? Was it quite far along? Or I suppose, did it vary dependent on how well the pregnancy was progressing?
Yes, exactly. Because in the case of a woman who had what we call hyperemesis gravidarum, which is when a woman who's pregnant has uncontrollable vomiting, she wouldn't be able to appear in public at all.
Yeah.
She would be sequestered, trying to control, with the midwife probably trying to control the vomiting. And then first-time mothers don't usually show very quickly, so they would be able to continue on as normal if they didn't have terrible morning sickness until probably well into their 7th month. And then, even after that, it wasn't unusual for women in the Tudor period to continue being seen in public because it was a sign that you're fertile and the king is fertile, and that's a really good thing.
Yeah, and I suppose, in particular, I'm thinking for someone like Anne Boleyn, it's also that ability, it's the ability to show off. I've done this, I am pregnant.
Absolutely.
You might hate my guts, but I'm pregnant.
La la la, yes.
Yeah. So was there regular meetings between a queen and midwives throughout the pregnancy, or was it very much a as and when needed?
I think it was as and when needed, but, there were definite times when there would be visits at the beginning of the pregnancy to confirm the pregnancy, and then probably mid-pregnancy, like around 20 weeks, and then at the end. Definitely there would be 3 visits, and then whatever was needed in between. If there was issues with whatever, morning sickness or what have you, pregnant women can get all kinds of uncomfortable symptoms that they might need to call a midwife for. Okay.
And I didn't include this in the initial set of questions, so hopefully it won't be too left field, but were there certain things that queens in particular were told to absolutely avoid when it came to what they ate or drank? Women today, when they're pregnant, are told to avoid certain things like certain cheeses and things. Was there anything like that at the time? Well,
alcohol,
obviously. But...
Yeah, no. Actually, they were told more things that they should eat. For instance, they thought that eating asparagus would ensure a male child.
Makes sense.
So they ate a lot. Yeah, doesn't it though? Yeah, so they ate a lot of asparagus.
We all know what asparagus does to the urine, so I bet that was lovely. So probably one of the most well-known aspects of royal birthing was the confinement process, but some may not know exactly what was involved in that, so can you break it down for me?
I'd love to. So the confinement process happened at about 36 weeks of pregnancy, and it began with the procession to the royal birthing chamber. And the birthing chamber would have been prepared previously with tapestries covering the walls and windows, the goal being to create a womb-like environment. And the procession would have included members of the court and the king and the priest. The priest would bless the room, probably with holy water, and then he would bless the queen and he would probably give her something. Actually, there's a story about a girdle that belonged supposedly to Jesus's mother Mary. And Catherine of Aragon was given that. And I believe also Anne Boleyn was also given that girdle. So it was normal to give gifts such as, holy items, prayer books, rosaries, and such. And then she would get a blessing from the king as well. She would go into the confinement room with some selected ladies and her midwives, and the door would be shut. And the men stayed out. It was strictly an all-women environment.
And am I correct in saying that even in the height of summer, they would have kept a brazier burning at all times? It must have felt incredibly claustrophobic.
Well, yes, that is a fact. It must have been absolutely horrendous. But I will say this, that it is a well-known fact. Well, actually, maybe not well-known, but it is a fact that England during the 16th century was experiencing a minor ice age.
Yes, yeah.
So the temperatures were not as high as they would have been normally.
Because, it could easily be that you go into confinement and you're there for a month, right? It could happen.
Oh, for sure, and longer. Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon, was in her confinement room for a really long time because she thought she was pregnant and then she wasn't pregnant, but she thought she probably could still be pregnant. And so they were like, well, just stay there. And eventually a baby will come. So she was in the confinement room for, I think, a couple of months.
Yeah. The putting of tapestries across all of the windows and shutting out any natural light and stuff. Was this all because there was this belief that sickness and everything was airborne? So it was about trying to safeguard mother and child as best as possible.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure what the reason was exactly because I haven't seen any really good explanation of why they did that.
We tend to think of the Tudors as being woefully ignorant of actual solid knowledge about the human body, illnesses, and by extension of that, of course, pregnancy. Would you say this is quite an inaccurate suggestion? Were there things that Tudor midwives were doing that we still see very prominently in births today?
Oh, absolutely. Because like I mentioned earlier, it's the same biological process. And I'm a home birth midwife by training. And I can tell you that for myself, I did a lot of apprenticeship before I was able to practice on my own. And you go around with a more experienced midwife and she teaches you the trade. And that's what Tudor midwives did as well. They learned with experienced midwives and they probably had to sit quietly at the beginning. And then as they learned more and were experiencing other things that came up during labor and birth, then they were allowed to pitch in and start helping. And they just gained experience mainly through apprenticeships.
I remember reading somewhere that things such as encouraging the mother to walk around, to, go on all fours, were things that the Tudors were encouraging at the time. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. There was a thing about walking. Yep, there definitely was.
And that's what we recommend today. So that, I think that's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose there is that for some people, although I don't do that in my practice. I let women decide how they want to labor, and I kind of follow their lead. I don't like to intervene much. I think you get a better result. The less interference, the better the result.
So on the flip side of that question, were there things that Tudor midwives were doing that we would be shocked by today that just would not happen in a birthing room?
Oh, definitely. Oh,
talk to me. What were they?
Yeah, there was this thing. I don't know where they got this, but they thought it would be a really great idea to make a plaster out of animal dung and put that over the woman's belly.
Right. Okay.
I don't know how much more bizarre, but that's probably the strangest thing that I've read. And I know they did other things like putting a knife underneath the mattress to cut the pain in half.
I've heard of that, yeah.
And unbinding the queen's hair. She wasn't supposed to have any braids or any binding in her hair whatsoever, because that was thought to impede the labor. If her hair was bound up, then the labor would be bound up.
I mean, that makes sense. Not.
Oh, it's so logical.
It is so bizarre.
I know.
Yeah, so when a queen would go into labour, typically how many people are on hand? Were they given specific roles each?
Yeah. So there were typically 2 to 3 midwives with the queen, and they would have different roles. I mean, one midwife could be coaching the mother, getting her to try different positions. One could be waiting for the baby, because there was always a midwife who took charge of the infant right away.
Okay.
Clean it and, get everything ready, dressed and ready for when the king came in. So there was a midwife for the mother, a midwife for the baby, and then another midwife on hand for whatever.
Okay. And what would happen in moments of extremely difficult births? So, for example, where a cesarean section was required, was this done by the midwife? What would would they have known that either mother or child are going to die? They're only going to make one survive. What was going on with that?
Yeah. So what was going on with that was, if a woman started to hemorrhage, and the midwife knew that she was going to die, she would have performed a cesarean section to pull the baby out before the baby perished as well.
Right. Okay. So the decision was taken, that we can't save the mother, but we can save the child.
If it was clear that that's probably the most common scenario in a case of severe hemorrhage.
And how about other things such as a breach or, the umbilical cord? Because when my mum went into labour with me, my umbilical cord was wrapped around my neck, so it was cut.
That's pretty common. Happens a lot.
How did they overcome that?
Just like we overcome it today. We unloop the cord around the baby's neck, and then the baby comes out. And you just have to know when to go in there and unwrap the cord. And the way we do it now is we're listening for the fetal heart tones. We know when they drop that there's a cord situation we have to take care of immediately. But in the Tudor times, midwives had to rely a lot on their instincts, because they didn't have the same kind of technology, obviously, that we do now. But they would have had many things at their disposal, such as very powerful herbs, such as pennyroyal or galbanum resin, which created powerful contractions of the uterus.
Okay. So they were working with something then that helped speed up the contraction process.
Yeah, if there was a protracted labor situation, then they would administer some kind of herbal draft.
Okay, that's interesting. I never knew that.
And they also, and then of course, like you mentioned, breach. If it was a breach, you can feel when you're feeling the woman's uterus on the outside, you can tell where the baby's positioned. So if you have a breech position where the baby is presenting with the bottom down, that's okay. That's not so bad, because the woman will open up just like as if it's a head there. But if it's a breech situation where you have feet coming out, that's very dangerous. And so she would have to tread very carefully if the situation like that arose. Sometimes during labor that took a long time, they would try to manually dilate the cervix, which really probably almost always ended up in an infection later on.
I see. Okay. I'm curious to know, as you are a fully qualified midwife, what do you think happened to Jane Seymour based on your knowledge?
Oh, it's really, really hard to know, because it doesn't follow the predictable pattern of a uterine infection.
Wasn't it retained placenta was the...
A retained placenta would cause bleeding, and that's not something I read about her birth. Retained placenta causes hemorrhage. So when a woman has a piece of retained placenta, if it's not removed, she'll hemorrhage. she'll just keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding because the body is trying to get rid of that piece of placenta, and the uterus can't contract properly with the placenta still inside. So that would have been a hemorrhaging situation. So it could have been that she had a postpartum infection, because that was pretty common back then, or it could have been something else entirely. You know, she was in bed for so long. It could have been that she developed an embolism. I've heard that theory bandied about. It's so hard to say because the records are so vague.
And because their understanding at the time was so just not where we would want it to be. So I suppose you're stabbing in the dark, essentially.
Right. Right. She did have a really rough birth, though. I know that she had midwives originally. They were kicked out and doctors were brought in. And it was not a good situation because doctors back then really were not trained to deal with birth. And she was having a really long labor. They didn't know what to do. And it was just so poorly managed that I imagine it very well could have been that some kind of an infection.
I see. Okay. Infant mortality was obviously much higher then than it is now. It was one of the big reasons why families, particularly noble families, had so many children, because invariably they would lose a couple along the way. Were midwives ever accused of being responsible for the premature death of a baby?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're looking for someone to blame, it's going to fall on the midwife. And midwives were notoriously accused of witchcraft. Yeah. So it was tough times for midwives.
So to move on from queens and queen consorts, I'd also like to just touch on the nobility and the gentry. So I assume for these group of women that midwives were also called upon. Is that the case? Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. Members of the peerage had the best of the best.
And did they go into confinement like a queen would?
They did.
Okay.
Yeah, they did.
And it was very much the same sort of setup?
Yeah, it was very much the same sort of setup. Yeah, they pretty much imitated what the queen did.
And was it also, because confinement, as you mentioned earlier, that it was an exclusively female environment?
Definitely.
So was that, again, that was the case across the board?
Yeah, across the board.
Am I right in thinking that it was actually Margaret Beaufort who was quite instrumental in developing?
Absolutely. She was the one who decided all of the royal protocols for the Tudor era. Yeah, it all boils down to Margaret Beaufort and her logic or lack thereof.
Well, I think it's well documented, isn't it, that it's very likely that because she gave birth at such a young age that thereafter she was either terrified of giving birth or more likely maybe was so badly damaged that she never carried more children.
Clearly. Yeah, clearly that's the case. Yeah, because she had quite a few marriages. She was married 3 times, so she would have had pregnancies if she were capable of them. She must have been really badly damaged.
By extension of that, I'm curious to know because there's also a theory about Henry VIII being Kell positive, I think.
I absolutely ascribe to that theory. It makes so much sense.
So for those who don't know, can you explain it?
Yeah. So Kell's blood type, it's very rare, and it's believed to have originated from Jacquetta of Luxembourg.
So the mother of Elizabeth Woodville.
The great-grandmother of Henry VIII. And she, apparently there was some issues in the male side of her family with lots of infertility problems, just like with Henry VIII. So the theory is that Henry VIII had inherited this Kell's type, blood type. And the women that he was with, his wives, did not have the Kell's blood type. And so there was an incompatibility there, and it caused miscarriages and fetal demise and all kinds of problems. Usually the first baby would have been born normally because the woman hadn't developed antibodies yet to the incompatible blood type, but then consequent births would have resulted in miscarriage or stillbirth. But there's a 50-50 chance that the baby would have been normal. So that explains Mary being born.
I was about to ask, yeah, because as I understand it, based on what you've said and as I've read before, what that blood type does is that, as you said, the first pregnancy would be okay. Subsequent pregnancies, the body would almost treat it like an alien.
Exactly.
And because of that, where Mary is the fifth born child, I think, to Catherine and Henry, she obviously survives. And a lot of people have said, well, that's proof that Henry wasn't Kell positive. But based on what you've just said, he still could have been, and Mary was just lucky.
I think he most definitely was, because he went on to develop McLeod syndrome, which is associated with the Kell's blood type. And that's basically this bizarre personality change. They become psychotic and rageful and unpredictable, just like Henry.
I have to admit, when I first heard about the belief that he could have been Kell positive, it does make a lot of sense. It just adds a level of context there.
It really
that,
does.
as I say, it's a logical conclusion. So, how did Tudor midwives learn their craft? You know, I'm assuming they weren't doing a degree or going on a course in the way we would today. So, was it past? How were they learning what they did?
Apprenticeship.
Okay.
Yeah, they learned from more experienced midwives. They would have followed the midwife from birth to birth, and also they would have gotten training on how to employ the usage of herbs for different problems. So they definitely picked up their training from being an apprentice.
And you mentioned earlier that midwives were among the group who were most susceptible to being labelled witches. And is that because they dealt in things like herbs and creating tinctures, and they're trying to fix the body with things that it could be argued at the time may have been felt was unnatural? Is that kind of what it was all about?
Yeah, I think just there was a lot of suspicion of midwives having secret knowledge. And, maybe there was even some envy. Why are they so smart? How do they know so much? Oh, they must be a witch. Oh, she's a witch. So,
well, it was also, I suppose, just the inherent misogyny of the time as well, because
I think so. Yeah,
because this is also it's a. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but it does feel like it's probably one of the very, very few professions at the time, which is women. That all other professions that I can think of were maybe a combination of men and women, but this feels very much like it's a female space. It's a female craft. Yeah,
you have the archetype of the wise woman, and that's just associated with witchcraft, because the knowledge was exclusive to women primarily.
Were midwives paid? Were they well paid?
Well, royal midwives definitely were well compensated. For the poorer classes, probably there was something like a trade. You deliver my baby and I'll give you a chicken, or you deliver my baby and I'll give you 5 gallons of milk. Because the poor women didn't have the coinage to pay their midwives, but they would do some kind of trade with them.
Well, that's what I was about to ask, was when it comes to the commoners and then beyond that to the poor, the destitute, what help were they getting?
They would always have a midwife. The midwife would come. I mean, there were midwives for villages, and they would go to births. And if it was someone really poor, they would probably send their poorly trained apprentice to go deal with it.
So before we finish, what I'd also like to just touch on is your upcoming book. You mentioned earlier that you are a full-time writer, and you've got a historical fiction novel coming out, The Tudor Queen's Midwife. So can you introduce the book for me? Who's the main character? What's it about?
Sure, I'd love to. The book is called The Tudor Queen's Midwife. It's available on Amazon. And it's about primarily, so the first book is about Catherine of Aragon and her midwife, who is an escaped Jew from Spain. She escaped the Inquisition, fled with her husband and young child. Her husband was a physician, and it is a historical fact that there were Jews who fled Spain and decided to go to England, where they lived secret lives because it was illegal to be a Jew in England from the 1200s, when Jews were officially kicked out of England.
Yeah, the expulsion.
Yeah. So they had to live secretly as Jews, and they had to go to church and outwardly appear Christian. So I tried to add a layer of intrigue and historical interest by making the character someone who'd escaped from Spain. And obviously there's tension because Catherine of Aragon's parents were Isabella and Ferdinand, who were the instigators of the Inquisition. So we have that, and then we have all of the tragedies and some triumphs of pregnancy during the Tudor times. So the first book follows Catherine of Aragon, and then the second book follows Anne Boleyn. And yeah.
Nice. Okay. So what inspired you to tell these particular stories? I suppose it's a combination really of what you're trained as and your passion for history.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a book that just had to be written because seeing the whole story of Henry VIII unfold through the eyes of a midwife is just a really interesting perspective. And I didn't feel like it was a story that had been told yet and it needed to be told. And I was fascinated with the history of the crypto Jews living in England at the time. And that combined with the fact that most of them were in the medical profession, it just all sort of fit together.
Yeah, what do you mean by a crypto Jew? It's not a saying I'm very well aware of.
Crypto meaning hidden.
Okay,
so
fine.
There were these hidden Jews.
Okay.
Just Jews that had to be underground. They practiced their religion, but in secrecy.
Okay, that makes sense. And to your point, doing something at the court of Henry VIII, Henry VIII's reign is so much of it is characterized by his inability to secure that male heir. So I think it's such an interesting story to focus that around what happened to Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn. And then I'm assuming book number 3 is going to be Jane Seymour? Or?
No, Jane Seymour's in the second book. The third book is going to be primarily about the reign of Mary Tudor.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to write these books. It's been just great. I've loved every second of it. It's been really enjoying. And of course, there are Cavalier King Charles Spaniels in there too.
Yeah, I feel Mary as a character, I feel, gets an unfair bad rap, and I actually feel quite sorry for Mary in many respects. And I think do you believe that she was suffering with pseudocyesis?
I'm not really sure. I think that's actually possible that she may, in 1555 had a real pregnancy. And that's my working theory right now, is that she did have a pregnancy that she may have at that point miscarried, and then consecutive pregnancies afterwards. I haven't really formulated a firm opinion yet. I'm working on it because there are some interesting theories out there about whether or not these were real pregnancies, or really was it just, that she wanted to have a child so badly that she tricked her body into thinking it was pregnant. I mean, that can happen, but it's really rare.
Yeah, it is a real thing, isn't it? It can happen.
It is a real thing. It can happen. It's exceedingly rare, though.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat about Tudor Midwifery. This has been so interesting. So are you on social media? Where can people find you?
I am. I am taking my first forays into social media because I'm not a very public person, I guess. I'm very introverted. So I have a new Instagram account called The Tudor Midwife, and you can go there and find me. And you can also go to my website, which is thetudormidwife.com.
Wonderful. And both books 1 and 2 available already, or is it just book 1 at the moment?
So book 1 is out. It's been out now for a couple of weeks, and book 2 will release probably in 9 to 12 months.
Amazing. Okay, cool. Well, thank you again so much for coming on for a discussion, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Thank you so much. It was a joy.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to Brigitte for coming onto the show to discuss Tudor midwifery with me. Next week, I'm going to be joined on the podcast by author Elizabeth Levasse for a discussion about one of my favourite subjects, Anne Boleyn portraiture. A wee teaser, but Elizabeth might just be on the cusp of some exciting portrait discoveries. That'll drop next Thursday. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.